So, welcome everybody. My name is Anja Schäffers. I'm situated at Southern Cross University on the east coast of Australia. My background is coastal geomorphology. And here in Australia, we have a custom that we acknowledge country first and their custodians. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the respective lands on which we all work, learn, and live, and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. And we pay respect to elders past and present and emerging, and to all First Nation people who are here with us today. So, who is a senior environmental consultant at JB Pacific to Australia from the 2 years ago, and will share with us his knowledge about understanding coastal resilience in a changing climate. Over to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks, Anya. I don't know if you might cut out a little bit then, or it was just for me. So, but I appreciate the introduction nevertheless. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. But yeah, I'll jump straight into the presentation. I guess first off, just a bit of a session overview from what I'm going to talk about today. A bit of background first, setting the scene before we have a deep dive into sort of, I've titled it Dealing with Uncertainty, but it's a bit of a deep dive into the practical ways we use model data to better understand risk and manage future adaptation and come up with resilience measures in various scenarios, and then a couple of applications in practice as well. So I dive into some of the work we've been doing. So yeah, I'm based here in Australia. The accent might have given it away, but I'm originally from the UK, with about 11 years experience in the sector. So hopefully what I have to share will be insightful. On with the first slide, I suppose. First off, the challenges of sea level rise and why coastal resilience matters. I've pulled up sort of 3 key statistics on screen just to set the scene really, but 10% of the global population would live within 5 kilometers of the coast. A little bit meaningless in some ways because the coastline varies. Not all of that 10% of the population will be at risk. So taking a level down from that, we can look in the SEA region particularly with 1 meter of sea level rise, 410 million people. So those numbers start to mean something. And in Australia, just recently, with a bit of a future look under the new climate change risk assessment that was just released last month, around 1.5 million people exposed to coastal inundation within the next 25 years. So not an insignificant risk and something we have to sort of monitor closely. What sea level rise looks like, here's some model data, just showing the sort of magnitude of what that looks like on the ground at various locations. This is a model I've produced in the mid-coast. I'll talk about it in a case study a bit later on. But sea level rise projections from 0 to 2 meters above present day. So you can see there's some quite vast areas of land there that are absorbed and inundated as those scenarios progress through in that little animation there. Touching on the global drivers, hopefully everyone should be reasonably aware of these, but increased greenhouse gases trapping heat causing the ocean water to expand, and increased temperatures from fossil fuel consumption accelerating ice loss through that higher global average temperatures, which further increase sea levels. So yeah, 2 key drivers, but there's a multitude of other things in that climate change space that happen as a result of changing processes on a global scale. What that looks like more locally, I say I touched on sea level rise being a global phenomenon, but the impacts become highly localized. Different topography along the coastline, different anthropogenic factors, including where people are and aren't. So yeah, different tidal regimes as well, I suppose, is another one, but it emphasizes the importance of needing localized risk assessments and really understanding the unique nature of and characteristics of the places we're investigating in more detail. So just something to take that sort of global high-level statistics to the next level to really help the communities that matter. So when we're looking at coastal risk, vulnerability and understanding vulnerability is sort of the key first part of that process that we need to have a bit of a deep dive into. I like to categorize vulnerability into three core themes. There's various ways of looking at this, but for time's sake and presentability, we'll split it into three core categories here. So infrastructure, communities, and ecosystems. And the next few slides, I'll just break down those in a bit more detail as to how we can investigate those and understand them more comprehensively. So infrastructure, typically the built environment, you're looking at fixed assets, very location dependent and have a number of design limitations, often expensive, high value, requires significant investments and considerations when building new infrastructure. Not always able to relocate things, and retrofitting equally can be challenging if new risks emerge. Something wasn't designed properly, it's not always possible to change that functionality and maintain I guess the use as intended of such infrastructure. And then also one thing with infrastructure, failure of one asset might lead to poorer or limited performance of other services. So you get that sort of cascading impact effect. So if you move a road, if there's no other roads connecting an area together, you get that sort of propagation and those other services no longer function. So it's always something to be mindful of when undertaking any sort of risk assessments and trying to manage resilience. There's always some sort of cascading impact to be mindful of. When we start to look at communities, things change a little bit, heavily tied to infrastructure as you'd expect, but a little less fixed. People can move around and manage that risk more dynamically. So you can leave an area and come back to it when it's safe to do so. But yeah, there's various factors at play there, be it population density, the capability and economic health of such population and their access to support mechanisms. Equally, there's always a sense of place and attachment. I know I've called a few places home, be it here in Australia or back in the UK, and they'll always be home for me. That's a very sentimental thing I'm sure each and everyone on the call has their own view of as well. Talking about sort of retrofitting in the infrastructure sense, there's the adaptive capacity of people to manage that situation themselves at a more localized level. So protecting your own property or changing behaviors to manage risk. And another thing to bear in mind is that risk is constantly evolving as well, especially in the light of the changing climate. So it's not a static thing, and it's something that can change with governance and policy as well by those in higher places, should I say. Lastly, we have ecosystems, and this is probably one of the key ones that brings all this together, because it's at the bottom of the slide there, but poorer ecosystem health leads to less carbon sequestration and ultimately ends up with more warming to simplify that in its highest level. So ecosystems are critical to managing coastal resilience and future climate risks, but there are also some constraints there. So habitat connectivity and natural migration, the abilities of ecosystems to move and manage their own risk, be it through species resilience and their tolerance to changing conditions, the natural adaptive capacity to amend that themselves. But equally, as humans, we do often get involved and do manage restoration and active management of these ecosystems as well to try and promote better ecosystem health. So a bit of a core sort of overarching question when you'd look at vulnerability, and a key thing to think about throughout this presentation is really, when do things become unsustainable? There's a couple of sort of comedic photos there on screen, but people are generally pretty resilient in the face of risks. And yeah, at what point do you say enough's enough, this isn't sustainable? And so setting triggers, thresholds, and understanding when vulnerabilities become critical through time is a key part of the work we do in this coastal resilience space. So I'll touch now on a framework which we like to use here in the JBA group, which JB Pacific is part of. We sort of call it the 4 pillars of understanding resilience. So there's 4 components to this, which are aware, adapt, respond, and recover. I will draw attention that there's a link on these slides, hopefully to get circulated after, but there's a really handy video that will break down this framework in a far more comprehensive way than I can in a couple of minutes. But fundamentally, these 4 pillars of resilience give us a start point as to what ways we need to look at things and what order we proceed through our risk assessments to really benefit more sustainable futures for communities, people, infrastructure, ecosystems. And the first step on that journey is being aware of what hazards there are and what those vulnerabilities are. So it's a good place there where sort of modeling and mapping sits. A lot of what I do in my day-to-day work is raising awareness of these things. But equally, that naturally leads to adaptation, where you can then use that awareness to strengthen infrastructure and ecosystems to manage and reduce that risk. Inevitably, disasters do happen and there will be setbacks. So using that awareness and adaptation, we can build response mechanisms to that, be it through direct sort of retrospective response immediately following a disaster, or setting up to respond to that in a more proactive manner, such as early warning systems and emergency management. And then last but not least is that recovery step. So how do you get back to this sort of condition that the system was in pre-disaster, and recover that environment, or even make it better? I think it might be on my next slide, which sort of breaks that down against a coastal risk framework, I suppose, here. I'll start a bit backwards here, but that recovery step is building back better. Why settle for, what was there before when we can be more resilient? But again, breaking this down into that coastal risk management space, the awareness is supportive determination of adaptation pathways. Adaptation itself, how could we manage over time? Do we need to be precautionary and just, go all out, defend ourselves for the next 100 years? Or do we take a more staggered approach where we look at interventions when a target threshold's reached, which is what that graph on the right sort of starts to indicate if you can digest the various parameters on there. I'll move on from that slide and just start to look into the challenges, and this is where we start to look at some of the more technical aspects of what we're dealing with in this space. So the biggest challenges, in my view at least, and perhaps many others with impact assessments, are number one, data. We're getting better at that globally, and I'll maybe touch on that in my closing comments. But the classic sort of saying, garbage in or rubbish in, rubbish out, stands true for many situations, and it's no stranger to this space at all. So always something to be aware of when trying to understand vulnerability and resilience and putting impacts to on-ground actions. But the one I'm going to focus on today is uncertainty, and it's a big thing in the climate space because who knows what's going to happen in the next, I don't know, 10, 15, 20, 100 years. Projections through time are a difficult thing. But so how do we start to deal with that uncertainty? I'm going to talk about this from a standpoint of simulation libraries in particular. So a bit of a definition here on screen of what a simulation library is. And it's a set of models to replicate real-world processes under a wide range of scenarios. Unlike your more event-based scenarios, where you might say there's a 1% AEP of something flooding, if that's not too technical for some of the audience, a 1 in 100-year chance of an event occurring. A simulation library takes a slightly different approach where we just model incrementally the impacts at different levels of risk. And then you can match those up or reverse engineer those to match future projections. Hopefully that'll make sense with this next graphic, which shows what a library looks like in the context of sea level rise. So on screen there's a typical sort of tidal signature that we can run through our hydraulic models. And there's 20 different permutations of that with a peak level increasing by 0.1 of a meter each cycle. So what we do when we translate that to the climate change side of things, you'll see there's the various SSPs, socio-economic pathways, by the IPCC-AR6 report there with different quantiles. So there are your different future projections ranging from, I guess, the more conservative approaches, which is the SSP1, to the extreme fossil fuel burning scenario, which is SSP5. I think most of the literature at the minute seems to think we're on track around SSP2 and 3, but we'll obviously await more climate reporting and better understanding as we move through into the next few years. But how this is linked to the library, I guess the numbers on that, you can see there's the years across the top, but each of those projections is tied to sea level rise through various tools. And you can see how we can link a particular library event from those 20 scenarios that are all pre-configured against all these different permutations of what the climate future might look like. So it's quite an easy way to test multiple things with a very limited number of scenarios. So strengths and weaknesses of this simulation library approach. It's generally future-proofed, as I've sort of touched on there. You can adopt it dynamically to what that future projection might look like and explore multiple permutations without the need for further iteration. And it does start to reveal thresholds and system responses when you tie that back to vulnerability as well, because there'll be key trigger points in there where, say in 2050, your sea level rise projection is, I don't know, 0.3 of a meter. If you know that that's a critical point where assets become unsustainable through your risk and hazard assessment, then it's only a good thing to be aware of. Some of the weaknesses, however, are that it does depend on embedded model assumptions, as with any model system. There's a saying that no model is right, and it will become dated very quickly. So it's always something to be mindful of. And equally, there's limited flexibility for new processes and hazards to be incorporated in there because it is a fixed sort of snapshot in time approach. One of the other main challenges with simulation libraries is it does require a bit clearer communication of results because it's a bit more synthetic and not tied to individual events. Making sure that's communicated to the communities or whichever audience you're presenting results of this sort of analysis to is quite critical and can cause challenges. So I'm going to touch on a couple of applications in practice now, which is where I've been doing work over the last couple of years here in Australia. Again, we'll open up to questions towards the end of that session as well. But the first one is in Mid Coast Council in New South Wales, Australia. Just last year, actually completed a tidal inundation study and asset vulnerability assessment, where we looked at sea level rise in particular, which was part of a broader coastal management program. So looking to build resilience for these communities and understand their risks. Follows a fairly simple framework that most people will have seen or been familiar with an image like this on screen, where risk is the sum really of your likelihood and consequence for any given scenario. But it's how we translate this back to simulation libraries and vulnerabilities on the ground that's important. So I'll start with likelihood. So we talked about those climate change projections for sea level rise through time and library events. We can, in this instance, determine that the SSP1 is almost certain to happen, which is that sort of conservative best case scenario. Whereas the rare likelihood is that we go to extreme sea levels under the SSP5 8.5 95th quantile, which is a real extreme upper bound projection from the IPCC. And each of those is tied into an individual sort of sea level rise library event through time, as you can see on that graph, ranging from present day, which is with the high water spring solstice, the HHWSS at 1 meter water level, ranging up to 2.8 in that most extreme event. So what does likelihood look like when you start to map that and it's not just tabulated? So this library of events we produced is a good graphic on the right-hand side there, where you see the red is almost certain, almost your present day risk, whereas the green are progressively more extreme and less confident in terms of those projections and what may happen going forward into the future. So things to consider with this and with anything is the accuracy of your spatial data sets. And also a slightly less obvious one with any modeling is that inundation is often represented from a surface level only. And you get a lot of buried infrastructure and assets that we often sort of miss and discount in these vulnerability type assessments. So it's something to keep in the back of your mind as well, that stormwater networks can fail far sooner than it appears. It may not even be mapped as at risk because it's buried, and you get sort of groundwater interactions as well and saltwater intrusion. So there's lots of systems at play and complexities in there to always be mindful when we talk about sort of likelihood and even consequence, which I'll move on to now. So consequence, we can tie this back to the vulnerability section a little bit that I opened with. There's consequences to people, property, and infrastructure in itself, which property is inclusive of, and then ecosystems and environmental areas as well. And I touched on those sensitivities of why they're important earlier. So how do we translate consequence into that risk sort of matrix and framework, and equally then use this simulation library approach to bring it all back together? This is a handy little graphic that just shows a tidal signature running through the middle there, with that high water spring solstice being the peak component in the middle of that plot. But you'll see there's various different categories or bands within that, being dry at all tides, wet at large tides, down to permanently inundated, which is below sea level ultimately. So we can use those as different consequence thresholds, or in slightly different iterations depending on the asset at risk, to infer that sort of consequence score. And this is sort of the outcome of that and what it looks like spatially in this mid-coast setting, where we start to produce maps of buildings where we can bring those risk and consequence data together and sort of visualize that for communities and help present where the focus areas should be and where you need to be thinking about these adaptation pathways and triggers, thresholds. When do you need to act, and what are we going to do in the future? And you'll see this is just over a 50-year time frame on the screen, but there's a fair number more properties at risk in this low-lying area, which can have quite severe consequences to those communities if that amount of sea level rise does come into fruition. We can also produce sort of tabular outcomes of this as well, as you'd expect, really. This is looking more at the environmental asset side of things, but you can see how through time and through different risks that changes for different ecosystems. I think in this instance, mangrove swamps, the MS graphic on the screen, is probably the most vulnerable of these, closely followed by the coastal wetlands, as you'd perhaps expect in that environment. I'll take a bit of a dive into my second case study now, which was actually some rapid response or emergency work for the Australian Reinsurance Pool Corporation, which is ARPC was their acronym there. So this was off the back of TC Alfred earlier this year, which was an interesting event in itself. It was going to be Cat 3 cyclone, then Cat 2, then nothing at all, and then Cat 3 again, and then spun around a few times off the coast and finally hit sort of the Brisbane, northern Queensland, southern Queensland, southeast Queensland region around March time, I think, this year. But what we got drafted in, or I got drafted into sport with here, is using this simulation library approach to rapidly do an impact assessment using forecast and live gauge data throughout the coastline. So not your typical sort of project that I usually work on in the consultancy space, because we probably had less than a few days preparation time to come up with a solution to support the client and deliver on their needs in this instance. So touching on the requirement a bit further, it was to capture both live and forecast gauge levels across the impact zone, which ranged from sort of Noosa down to Coffs Harbour. If you're familiar with the Australian landscape, if you're not, appreciate that might not mean much to you. But it's quite a large stretch of coastline. And yeah, we had to do a sort of high level appraisal of that entire stretch in a rapid turnaround which is where that simulation library approach came into its own, because it meant we could just build one set of models and utilize them in different ways to determine impacts. So a similar approach to the Mid-Coast case study I shared, where we look at sea levels at 0.1 meter increments, which gave us a nice sort of resolution to work with at this scale. So how we manage that and utilize this library to its full potential really is we split the coastline into various sort of impact zones, I'm going to call them, which was solely based around LGA, local government authority regions, and the gauge network density as well. Because obviously where you've got a gauge, you've got a bit more confidence in what's being read at that location, or perhaps even forecast. And where you've got gaps between them, that's where you're less confident, because there can be sort of little more localized things happening in those areas that are otherwise not captured. So resolution of the data highly important in this instance. But what we could do is tie that gauge data back to these flood footprints we produced within our model, and then we can do sort of depth damage analysis. So taking this a level up from that high level risk framework done in the Mid-Coast to actually individually assess monetary values at property across the entire region or the impact zone. So by nature of this, it was quite a rapid assessment. I think we were done and dusted within a few days, really, in terms of what the responsibilities of the project needed to achieve. But alongside that came a number of challenges, and it's just worth touching on some of them here, because there are always things to think about in any project or sort of assessment being undertaken. So first off, we had to be quite reactive. Yeah, it was very unknown going in. We had to just find what was out there. And one of the biggest challenges that came out of that was finding relevant data. And there's different organizations that manage the gauge network along the coastline in Australia. Getting that in a uniform, consistent way was quite challenging. And there was often issues with the gauge datums, which needed transposing to permanent survey marks before it became meaningful to us, and we could use it in our assessment to guide what was happening on the coastline in response to the cyclone. And equally, during the event itself, we had some extreme wave energy as a result, and some of the gauges failed and just stopped recording, which meant, you know, we had gaps in our assessment and had to sort of try and fill those as best as possible, which was where the library also helps, because we can interpolate and make best guesses based on neighbouring networks to find out what was going on in a particular region, along with on the ground reports as well. So we're actively following sort of the news and what people were seeing on the ground, comparing it and validating it to what we were finding from our desk-based analysis. The outcomes in this instance were probably a bit more tabular, and this is again a symptom of time. It's nice making pretty maps and communicating that to communities and people, but often the tabular format is the most accessible for sort of getting numbers and making a very quick and rapid assessment. But we actually looking at forecast water level data across the region twice daily in the end, I think we settled on, and had a simple lookup basically that said the forecast water level's this. What does that mean in the context of our modelled event library? And there's a very quick sort of matrix transition there that you can say, oh, that level, there's 1,000 properties at risk, or, you know, 10,000, whatever magnitude it might have been. Fortunately for us, Alfred, there wasn't a huge amount of risk in the end. The cyclone sort of was a bit underwhelming, if I can say that. There's still a lot of loss and a lot of flooding related to the event, but it could have been far worse, and we were quite fortunate in the sense that the tide levels were in a neat cycle at the time, so we weren't seeing the extreme offshore conditions that we might have done if the event was a week later. And I guess that would have further enhanced the use of this tool in its capabilities to prepare those that needed to be prepared and understanding those risks at a granular level. Apologies. So just some closing thoughts, I suppose, on a whole, and reflecting back on all of this work and what that means and how it can be used by others in the future to better understand and build resilience. So the great thing about coastal risk, which you can't be said for all, is and in particular sea level rise, is that you can see it coming. Sea level rise isn't a quick thing. It won't suddenly be tickling your feet and you're wondering why if your floors are wet. But we've got to maximize this time and communicate risk and plan effectively, and that's where these tools and libraries really help do that. So developing spatial strategies which are community tailored, depending on those vulnerabilities and levels of risk, how we can best manage that. And I've listed a few sort of bullet points on screen there around what typical approaches you might uptake, but that list's sort of endless, and like I say, you have to treat it dynamically to the situation in front of you in that community. And if we go back to the vulnerabilities, the sense of place, can infrastructure be moved? All of those elements play a part in determining the best course of action for building resilience to a region. So before I sort of wrap up with these slides, it's just a few thoughts on what's next. It'd be remiss of me to not mention AI or machine learning. I think every conference or presentation I've heard over the last couple of years, someone's mentioned it or at least referenced it. But it does have a big part to play in this space. I'll leave it maybe open to questions as how you think you might be able to use that sort of technology. But inevitably, we're actively looking at using it in the modeling space to improve the speed at which we can create these hazard data sets and risk data sets. I've put on the slide here better asset data. It's often one of the pitfalls in terms of understanding risks. We've got quite good at doing the mapping side of thing now and being very technical with these processes and understanding that, but we often don't know what's on the ground. And that's one of the biggest challenges I think I see in the sector at the minute, is making better use of asset data. Equally, AI has a place in that space as well. There's people using street imagery to really pick out details and floor levels of properties and things to a resolution that we wouldn't otherwise have captured through more traditional survey means. Remote sensing imagery to detect rooftops and things like that are sort of high on the agenda, and it's just getting better and better. So a really exciting space in terms of understanding our risks and how we can manage those. And on top of all that, there's always going to be new research. I think we're probably expecting IPCC's AR7 report in the next couple of years, which will inevitably have a different perspective or outlook of what the future climates look like under the various models that there are under the GCM, the global climate models. So always a space to be watching, and we just have to be dynamic and react to it as best we can. So I think that rounds out my slides. I don't know if, Anya, I want to hand back to you there. If timing should be okay.
Thank you, Andrew. That was most insightful. So we have a slide call to action where we have, if you select the next slide, Andrew, then there are a couple of questions just as stimulants for you to also bring to this group other questions you may have. But yeah, we wanted to touch on the local connection. That is, how do you think sea level rise could directly affect the communities that you are living near? Then again, if you had access to these realistic flood simulation maps or to this level of granularity that Andrew just presented, would it make a difference to your community or to your personal? Would it help you or your community to be more confident in decision making? And again, Andrew, you touched on that at your last slide, future resilience. What areas should be the top priorities for resilience planning? And you mentioned the data and having better access to data. I think that is a pretty common theme across all countries. But yeah, I invite questions for Andrew. You want to raise your hand if you have a question, or just unmute and Yushi.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. A great talk. And yeah, can you hear me?
Sorry,
Good.
I'm muted. Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you so much. Great talks and overviews of the coastal risk assessment in those areas. And I have a couple questions, more like technical questions, because I'm now working on a global climate models as a part of our IPCC's project. So we are willing to know how much the observation data is available to validate your simulation libraries in the coastal region, very fine scales phenomena. So we need that. We understand the tidal gauge data, but I think maybe we need a more observation network to support your activities in a very fine coastal scale, right?
Yeah, almost certainly. I can't speak too much for that sort of GCM space because it's not my area of expertise. But in terms of the observation data, it's paramount to a lot of the decisions we make inside this sort of resilience and climate adaptation space, and even in our local studies, looking at historic trend data for the present day. And it's often, talking about data and going back to that point, it's fundamental really to everything we do. But with that, there's a lot of maintenance expectations and costs and different responsibilities, which is, I think, always the challenge with that sort of gauge network is who's responsible, how's that data shared? And as I touched on from the TC Alfred event where we worked on, it actually became difficult to manage that data because it was so sparsely distributed between entities. So I know here in Australia, at least, the Bureau of Meteorology, that's a mouthful, are actually looking at bringing a lot of the inland gauge network together under this flood warning infrastructure network program that's currently ongoing. So there's definitely space for improvement there. But equally, you've got to bear in mind that consistent and reliable gauge data is probably something that's only really emerged in the last couple of decades. Previously, it was paper records that perhaps have now all been transcribed where they're in a format to allow that. So our understanding as the years go on will just keep growing as well, supporting things like the IPCC and making more informed decisions of what's happening in the climate.
Okay. And I have another question about some risk communications. So who are the major stakeholders or customers using your data set? And so how do you communicate with them about like uncertainties, especially? Because we researchers, technicians try to improve the accuracies of the predictions, using observation data or even simulation libraries. But most public people do not understand uncertainty in our results. So how do you communicate with them?
Yeah, it's a really good question and still a tricky one. I think people are getting better on a whole at understanding uncertainty and what that means. But there's almost a continuing battle there in terms of you've perhaps got older generations that are sort of, I've not seen that in all my time here. How are you now saying there's a risk and what that means? So yeah, an ongoing challenge, but I think the sooner you can visualize things and put them on maps or meaningful imagery, it certainly helps taking it away from perhaps the more technical sort of tabular formats that are perhaps more accessible to us as technical folk. But yeah, really visualizing what that risk looks like and just having open discussions about probability. I know gambling sort of often raised and rolling dice as a means to try and understand that in a more accessible market. But the real only way to sort of tackle that at a level is get in front of those people and talk to them and have those conversations, which is where we fall down often as technical folk. It's not perhaps our strengths by nature.
So one just clarify my question. So who is a like major stakeholders or customers using data?
No, sorry, yeah, I misanswered that in the broader context. But there was, yeah, we do a lot of work for governments, local government agencies.
Local government, okay.
So the people making the plans and sort of choosing where management activities need to take place. Through that, obviously, there's a lot of community engagement. So we are serving the communities primarily. But the government typically are the key stakeholders alongside any other sort of management groups and sort of landowners that might have a high interest in what's going on.
How about insurance companies interested in their data set?
Yeah, so not us ourselves at JB Pacific, but there is another arm of the JBA group called JBA Risk Management, who deals solely with insurers. It's a very good question because there's a disconnect at the minute between government and insurance perspectives on risk. Insurance sector driven largely financially. They are businesses at the end of the day and want to make money out of people, albeit for the greater good and protecting people and their assets and allowing them to re-establish themselves. But yeah, it's a very interesting space and one that's definitely worth watching closely as those two industries try and merge a little bit, or at least share understanding of risk to allow better decision making.
Okay, good. So do you have any plan to expand your systems across the Australia, for example, like Southeast Asia or East, or UK, your country?
So we've got a lot of mapping data available as JBA Group across the whole world, which we can use for very broad scale assessments. We've got some new stuff coming out next year, actually, or later this year, but a new component of that is actually mapping the coastline for inundation, sort of storm surge risk across 5 different probabilities. So not so much a library, but we are actively investigating ways we can use that as a library and transcribe what a 1% is now to a future scenario. So there's a lot of work going in that space, and sort of, let's say, global scale SEA region in Australia in particular is, I know, a focus of business activity.
Okay, thank you so much. I asked a lot of questions. So Jean wanted to ask some questions. So please, Jean, go ahead.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for a nice talk. I just said your system asked most of the question I want to ask, but there's one thing that I'm curious about, because you have mentioned that the biggest challenge is data and also uncertainty. I'm wondering how much data, of course, we want more data as a scientist, but how much data is enough to start for scientists or government to communicate with the local community? Or like, how do you distinguish what kind of data is a good data or not data, and not a good data? Otherwise, it will be garbage in and garbage out.
Very good question. Too much data can be quite time consuming at the same time. So ingesting large amounts of really detailed data doesn't get you anywhere. Well, it gets you somewhere, but you're almost too late at that point, to the point you should have made a decision years ago or months ago, weeks ago, whatever the circumstances. So a very good question. I don't know if I have the answer as to how much is too much. As a technical minded person, I'd always like to see more. But I think there's again a space here for AI and machine learning, which can process that information far faster than we perhaps traditionally could. At which point, that too much data to me now is very little data to a machine. And how you translate that back, I guess, to the communities, the government agencies, I guess it bridges that uncertainty gap. And if you can be more confident, more data points, more sampling, more validation, you can increase the confidence in what you're reporting to that end user, which ultimately is your everyday community and the people that are impacted by these risks and hazards. So yeah, I appreciate that's still an open-ended response, but hopefully gives some insights into my views.
Thank you.
I may ask a question in between. So I'm interested in what responses have you seen from communities? So what is there a kind of, approach you see most often that communities take, from the spectrum managed retreat to fortification?
Yeah.
And secondly, how applicable can this technology be for developing countries or communities who have lesser resources? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. So I'll answer the first question first, which is how I've seen sort of this translate into impacts, I guess, or have an effect on communities. A lot of my work here in Australia, I guess, has been over the last couple of years. So I've not been here that long to see the ongoing impacts of that work. There's obviously a lot of management and governments that needs to go in once these risks are understood. But talking from my UK experiences, I've seen schemes where information like this has been delivered, and especially in the light of managed retreat, it's a difficult conversation to have because communities have a very strong sense of place, as I touched on in that sort of vulnerability slide component. But ultimately, it's those difficult conversations that need to be had, and it largely comes back down to financial viability of sustaining life in those areas. And with that sort of almost sense of bias that you call somewhere home and want to stay there, you get sort of blinded by those risks and that uncertainty in some circumstances. So certainly difficult conversations to have, but equally you'll find that some communities are far more embracing than others, providing they've been taken on that journey and communicated throughout that process. So they understand their risks and why decisions are being made in the way that they are by those in sort of governance positions. So yeah, a real mixed bag, I guess, and it's down to us as technical folk sort of leading the charge on that understanding component, that we need to get that information in their hands in the most accessible way from the start. You'll have to remind me of your second question. Sorry, it's gone out of my head.
Yeah, this is fantastic data and fantastic I guess data for communities to understand and have this conversation. So how accessible and how easy is that to be delivered in communities with less resources?
Yeah. So it links a little bit back to the question Jean asked around data. We can do a lot in these communities and sort of developing nations where information is less accessible, but in doing so, that confidence in the outcomes is naturally lower. So yes, we can work in that space and deliver things, and there's always sort of that underlying question is knowing something better than knowing nothing, even if it's not entirely correct. And I think that's just a journey to go on. And like I say, as data becomes more available throughout the globe, that resolution will increase, and those communities need to be taken on that journey too. So somewhat aligns with your previous question to a degree. Is engagement is the core part of all this, and just sharing that understanding right from the technical people doing the climate change work down to the people on the ground and emergency responders that have to help clean up the post-disaster impacts.
Thank you. Any other questions for Andrew? You can also put them in the chat if you like. Yushi.
Sorry, sorry asking many questions. Yeah, but actually, I used to live in the east coast of the US, and local residents living along the coast are super rich. So they already know, they're aware of there's some risks, coastal risks, like flooding, but they can rebuild their houses even after their houses are swept away. But, so And also they can get some like governmental subsidies, to repair their houses. So that seems to be the feedback, some like, cause some feedback, like for the rich people's, like tend to living close to coast and neglecting the risks, those coastal risks. So that happened in the East Coast of the US. But I'm not sure some like demographic structures for coastal residents in the, for example, the Gold Coast or East Australia. So what is the current status of the people's mind or in the East Coast of the Australia?
I think it's very mixed between areas. There's certainly those high affluent areas like you've referred to in the US where people have enough money to manage those risks and absorb them and just accept that, they're in an environment that they really want to be in, and if something happens, they're financially stable enough for it to have minimal impact on their livelihood. Whereas in other places, we've done some work last year up in Dagara, which is an Aboriginal or predominantly Aboriginal community up in Douglasshire, north of Cairns. And the impacts for them, I mean, the work actually was reflective of TC Jasper in 2017. And they're still just about getting back on the feet now as a community. So it's that, I guess that, the financial component is a strong consideration in anything when you're looking at vulnerability. And it's how that translates. And usually it's in response and bringing communities back to their functional level that they were pre-event. And equally then there's a place there for trying to prepare them better for next time. So going back to one of my slides on that recover component of those 4 pillars of resilience, build back better or build back stronger is a buzz term that's bounded around a lot in this space. In that, even if it takes a lot longer, make sure that the outcomes for those people allow them to be more resilient next time something happens, because inevitably it will do.
I see. So I think that also related to the decision-making processes, but also for the future resilience, shown in this slide. For example, in Japan, after the big tsunami hit our countries, some of the cities, start to develop some like seawall, very high seawall. So which allows us not to see the ocean, from the continent. So that destroyed our lands, sceneries, even the marine environment, under the sea. So there are some always conflict with the fisher industries, because of shortage of some fish catch after the tsunami hit and building the high seawalls. Do you have such kind of stories in the Australias for this kind of the bad influence?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion always with how you adapt to changing climate, be it through sort of green or grey infrastructure, as it were referred to, so nature-based solutions or building more concrete seawalls and things. And it's an ongoing debate. The efficacy of nature-based solutions isn't always that you would get through greener, more sustainable solutions. But it's something I think as science evolves and our understanding of the environment evolves, we'll inevitably get better at managing. And a lot of that starts in the planning space and where we build our assets and settle. A lot of the times like you talked in the Japan sort of case where they're building really high seawalls, that infrastructure is there. It's, I guess the cost benefit ratio will have been looked at, and rather than move it, which isn't a sustainable outcome, the best solution was perhaps to build a wall in that instance. But let's say going forward, you'd perhaps not have built there in the first place with our enhanced understanding of risk. So some of that is legacy work, and other is better management practice through our understanding.
Yeah, we need to strike a right balance between preserving the ecosystems and also, developing some infrastructures against those coastal risks. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
It's all right.
What is your outlook on mangroves? I mean, mangroves are already under lots of pressure. So from your modeling, you are suggesting that are the most vulnerable coastal ecosystems.
Yeah, I mean, mangroves are an interesting one, and it's not my direct expertise. You know, Dan, yourself and you, who I work with quite closely, has got an avid interest in mangroves. But one of the big challenges is mangroves they're in such a dynamic environment that they need shelter to grow and develop. So they're not just that sort of thing you can go and plant and forget about and think, oh, that's great, that's going to solve the problem or provide coastal protection that I need. It's got to be a lot more sort of managed than that. But equally, natural migration of mangroves, which is what I think the slides referred to as the biggest threat, is we often build behind them if we haven't already removed them. And with sea level rise, there's nowhere for them to move to sustain that sort of intertidal range that they like to be in, which is dry and wet. So yeah, really challenging, and I guess vulnerable in that space, that if there's a road embankment even behind the mangroves and they can't move backwards, you're going to lose that ecosystem and then the protection it provides as well with that.
Interesting, and it's not only the protection, it's also the fishery and the nursery.
Yeah.
It's really profound rippling impact. So are you aware of any studies in this space, how vulnerable, or in a spatial sense, how vulnerable mangroves are to this globally?
It's probably one thing that we're looking at, and there's various studies going on a lot in the Pacific Island nations where we look at it as a means of managing coastlines through greener solutions, but understanding resilience of existing mangroves and their capability to sort of be sustained or migrate is I guess somewhat limited. There's data sets out there certainly which track them through remote sensing, and we can do things with our global mapping capabilities to understand their exposure. But doing that at scale, I don't think it's not something I've looked at specifically. Certainly, there's a study in there for someone if to go and investigate and come up with some statistics that would be highly meaningful in that space, because, like you say, they're a highly valued ecosystem. Offering multiple benefits.
Thank you, Andrew.
That's okay.
If there are no other questions, we have 3 minutes left. Is there a last minute question from the audience for Andrew? Otherwise, I really thank you on behalf of Future Earth Coast and the SIMSEA network, and said the session will be recorded and available on the FEC YouTube channel.